Hello and welcome to Channel 12. With us today, Ori Sascha, Head of Research and Director of Content for IDSF, Israel's Defense and Security Forum. Hello, Or, how are you doing?
Hello, Gil. Good to be with you.
So, today's war is very complicated. There are many different fronts to think of, and Israel, especially, we're such a small nation, very influenced by public opinion, international public opinion. How are we doing on that front?
Yeah, first of all, I think Israel has to take into account that beyond the military battlefield, and which means air, ground, sea, cyber, we also have another crucial component in war, which is legitimacy. And I think the political front, the diplomatic front, is not less important. And historically, Israel has been very good at focusing, on the sword and not on the word. I think if you take into account, for example, Henry Kissinger, the famous Secretary of State of the US, he said that Israel only has a domestic policy, it doesn't have a foreign policy. I think any nation basically is like that. If you take into account his very country, the United States, I don't think Americans go to the ballot box voting for any foreign issue whatsoever. But I also think that he has a point in Israel having to focus also on the political front, the diplomatic front, the international front. And I don't think we're doing very well on that front. It's the result of years and years of really tireless work by pro Palestinian groups, the Palestinian Authority itself, BDS, all these movements that have been gradually winning hearts and minds in the world. But I don't think we're doing as bad as people believe. Israelis often say the world, like in the. I don't know if you take most Chinese people don't take that much interest in what's going on in Israel. It's already 1.5 billion. Most people in India are either for Israel or pretty impervious, or um, so it's another 1.3. If you take 200 million evangelicals in the United States and Brazil, you take so many nations around the world. Of course, a Jewish community. You got big friends of Israel around the world, Central European countries, Eastern European countries who are very pro-Israel. So what are you left with? So the world in general is mostly the Arab world and Western Europe, big chunks of the United States, Canada, and of course some parts of Africa. So I think in that sense, we need to not to think as the situation is that serious as it is, but I think Palestinians have been, battling for the souls, and we have been battling for the minds. And I've asked my professor in Sciences Po, what's the difference between persuade and convince? And I think Palestinians have been persuading over time, as in speaking to the heart, and we have been trying to convince, speaking to the mind, to the logos. And I don't think that's the same thing. We can't come with arguments and expect everybody to be convinced. We also need to persuade.
So, two things before you continue. One is that we need to look at the effective international support that we can get. I mean, yes, of course, you're right. China, I'm guessing that they have no idea what's really going on, but they're not really affecting us very directly on an international level. For example, in the UN votes, which I think is a lost battle anyway, because there are just too many Arabic and Muslim countries. And so this is one thing. I mean, I think where Israel needs to focus is the hearts and minds of Americans, for example, where we are very dependent on what they think of us. And the second point that you brought, and I wanted to encounter, I forgot, but it will come up in a second. So just what can we do where it counts in the US area, for example? What can we do to get more support there?
I think we have to separate the two arenas. As you mentioned, the United Nations, the UN, I think it's a fatally irrelevant arena. I don't think Israel should invest too much resources there. And I mean it seriously. Look, you're talking to someone, and sometimes when I say these things, I'm being blamed for being isolationist, blaming the world for being anti-Semite and being sort of inward looking. And I'm absolutely the opposite of that. I studied for 2 years in Europe, and I've visited quite frequently Europe and the United States. I speak 5 languages, and much of what I do in the IDSF, what we do, research and content, is content in English, policy papers to explain the situation and to sort of mediate reality to diplomats, to members of Congress who are briefing thousands of people. So it's really not about isolationism. I just think that the United Nations is fatally irrelevant. When you test the criteria, what's the criteria of being relevant in the United Nations for as condemnations, for example? So you take a look at 85% of resolutions in the UN General Assembly are concentrated on condemning Israel, and you ask yourself if Israel. I'm sure Israel is not beyond criticism. It's not above criticism, and it's certainly imperfect. But is it responsible for 85% of the world's problems? I hardly think so.
Yeah.
What are the criteria? The number of fatalities? It's 0.1% probably of the world's population. In one day in Hama, Hafez al-Assad killed, a fair number of people, more than 50 years of conflict. So I'm trying to understand there is no other way to explain it than pure anti-Semitism. But I also think that the United States, you mentioned, we gotta speak their language a little bit more. We can't, I believe, the state of Israel, and we're already going to the solution part, which I love, but I think Israel has to understand that public authorities, like the public sector, will never be as good as the private sector in explaining these things. I'm sure it's great that Prime Minister Netanyahu goes out and explains, and he does it perfectly well. IDF spokesperson Agari does it perfectly well. It's nothing to do with them. It's the image of someone who is a governmental figure or an IDF figure that is automatically perceived as not objective. And I think Israel has to invite, for example, more foreign correspondents to Gaza, Instagram and TikTok influencers to accompany IDF soldiers in Gaza. We have to go to campuses not with heads of departments in the foreign ministry, which is great, but also with young people from the broad spectrum of the Israeli society. And God bless, we have such a variety and diversity of people from all walks of life. And I think when you do that, I feel it when I speak to groups of youngsters, both in Israel and abroad. I can relate to them with their language more than anyone who is 60 years old and has 50 years of experience, whatever, in public diplomacy has. I see the amazing work that is done by Ben Shapiro, or by other people who are extremely, like Megyn Kelly. She's also a woman. She speaks sort of the trendy language of the U.S. This is the language, and for each person, you have to choose probably the figure that they sympathize with the most. I think we should set an army of people from a diversity of walks of life.
Yeah, so it brings me back to the point I wanted to bring up earlier, is that it's an uphill battle against the zeitgeist. Because today the conflict is being perceived as the weak versus the strong, and Israel is we find it funny in Israel, but we are perceived as the strong in this conflict, even though we are only 7-8 million against, if you look at the numbers, against 400 million perhaps Muslims around us. But yet we are losing face, especially among young people. So I believe that yes, TikTok and other platforms where young people are present is a good place to start fighting back. But I would like to maybe take the conversation to a different place. Outside of us fighting the information war, maybe we could have done better preparation to not get into a problematic area. And what I mean by that is maybe we could have prepared better to, for example, the occupation of Gaza that we're currently going through. We are sending our troops to very risky search and destroy missions to find tunnels. And the main reason, I think, is because we are unable to separate the civil society from the Hamas militants. And because of that, we had all these issues with legitimacy when we bombarded and perhaps had too much collateral damage in the international arena perception. And I believe that if we were able to evacuate the citizens better, we would just not go into this entire information arena. For example, if we gave them better alternatives, such as a very big tent city, that Israel is taking care of all the humanitarian aid, not the Hamas. They don't get anything. And we allow the civilians to go there to get to have an alternative, a safe alternative. Maybe then they would leave. And if they would have left, we could have bombed the suspect houses where we think there are tunnels, and we would not hurt civilians and just not get into this problematic point to begin with. And
Yeah.
another point I saw this and is the evacuation of hospitals. For example, Israel could have bring cruise ships that are converted into hospitals and evacuate all the sick people into them. And then again, we would dodge this bullet of legitimacy when it comes to hospitals, because we would just have a solution how to evacuate the civilians to them. And the last point I would make is that I think Israel could have learned this lesson already, because we saw what happened in Mosul in 2016. At the end, 90% of buildings were destroyed. And I think we're going to the same end game, perhaps, but we could have avoided many civilian deaths and also, of course, many soldiers that are risking their life in Gaza. So I'm just saying, better preparation, we could have just avoided the entire situation to begin with.
Well, I agree and disagree. I'll tell you why. Two things can be correct at once. One is that you're right in saying that a truly wise man does not know how to, troubleshoot problems or resolve problems. They know how to not to enter into the problem in the first place, and that's
Exactly.
true. On the other hand, what is also true is that whatever Israel does, it will get a slander of criticism, a heap of criticism that is volatile, that is anti-Semitic. And I'm not saying that in sweeping statements toward the international community. I think that it's just an observation. I'll just give you an example about the Jenin operation in last June. Last June was an operation in Jenin where there were about I think a brigade and a half of IDF soldiers who really raided the Jenin refugee camp while the city of Jenin was intact. And they operated there for a good 2 or 3 days. That's all. I mean, not nearly as much as this war. You know how many people were killed in the Jenin raid, in the Jenin refugee camp raid? 12. We know their names and we know their pictures, and they were all armed to their teeth. We arrested, I think, over 300 or 400, and that's a real hornet's nest. It came not in a void. It didn't come in a vacuum. It came after months and months of shooting attacks and dead Israelis. So we said, okay, let's clear this hornet's nest and take away all the weapon and ammunition and all that. And the United Nations, Guterres, the international media, many of them reacted in a hysterical way in saying that Jenin is going through, a disaster of biblical scale. The European envoy, Bugsdorf, said that there is a suspected extrajudicial killing. And they also said Israel should allow people to evacuate. While we did. So they didn't. They don't say. They almost never lie. They almost always just say half truths. Israel should allow people to evacuate, but they did. That's what they're not mentioning. Israel did kill thousands of people in Gaza. They're just not mentioning that the vast majority are terrorists. So it's really about telling half truths and less about the lies. I read many lies. I read that since Hamas took over in 2007, there were no entries and exits of Gaza, while there were 20 or 30,000 workers coming in and out of Gaza every day in the last few years, and even a day before the massacre, right? That Israel does not impose siege on Gaza because it has a border with Egypt. So all these things should be much, much better explained. And I think for that, we created a database called warinisrael.org, warinisrael.org, where we really concentrate all the statistics and numbers and the figures that people should know. Gaza is hardly the most densely populated city in the world. The stories, people in Israel are really, everyone is a story here. And I don't think we are hardly, doing a bit of a good job there in communicating these stories to the world. So I hope this helps. But I also think you're right that Israel could have done more to at least, marketize what it does in the world. I also think that it could have been it's not impossible that there were other considerations. Egypt just refuses to open the border to Gaza refugees.
Yes, of
The whole
course.
situation could have been avoided if they were allowed to go to El Arish in Egypt. Maybe we fear that a floating hospital like France proposed would just entail Hamas terrorists embroiling with the masses and going to that ship, fleeing Gaza, maybe even fleeing with hostages. The whole situation is pretty complex because Gaza civilians and Hamas are pretty much intertwined. You see the crazy level of support for Hamas in Gaza,
Yes, of
even
course.
more so
Hamas.
since
Sorry. No, Hamas is a local group. Their families are in Gaza, and so of course it's intertwined,
yeah.
and the separation is so difficult. But again, I believe that if we had a safe zone where Israel controlled it, and we had some buffer that we can filter who's coming into the safe zone, and this safe zone would be a good and safe alternative for the people of Gaza, I believe that the locality of Hamas would work against them because it would be very hard for them to convince people to stay in their houses with no electricity and the chance of being bombarded, and they would leave. And for example, again, going back to Mosul, where ISIS were holding prisoners, it's not their families, it's the civilians were their prisoners. They could hold them in the house at gunpoint. But I don't think Hamas
Right.
can do it because it's a positive and it's also a negative for them because they're not able to hold the civilians when a better alternative is offered to them. Last point I would like to, because you talked you talked a lot about information or the lack of it, and I have a big question. I think the one of the most basic numbers that I hear it changes a million up and down. How many people live in Gaza? How many people are there? How many civilians are there?
So the last census was 2.1 million people. It was over the course of this year. In the city of Gaza itself, to be honest, it's a little over a million. And I think,
Mm,
it's the largest city in the Gaza Strip. But if you take a look at the parameter, at the area of the city, take the Gaza Strip for example. If you take the whole area of the Gaza Strip, 365 square kilometers, I don't know how much it is in miles, but it's close enough. 365 square kilometers with 2.1 million people. Do the math. It's a little over 5,000 people per square kilometer. Just for the sake of comparison, Bnei Brak in Israel has 26,000. Okay, more
mm,
than 5 times. So really, Bnei Brak in Israel, an Orthodox city, is 5 times more densely populated than Gaza. Manhattan is more, I believe, 6 times more densely populated than Gaza. So again, we can throw all the spaghetti on the wall we want, and eventually something will catch. But we can criticize Israel. I have tons of criticism, but at the end of the day, not every crazy thing that people say should be true. And I also think it has to do with the issue of legitimacy. I think at the end of the day, Israel is not to be blamed in this situation. I recognize that very often people in the world will, first of all, they talk about Israel versus Palestine, which is a totally misleading terminology. We have to lead the fight in changing the terminology. There is no such thing as Palestine. There is Gaza and Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria. Palestine does not exist. It never has. But if we talk about Israel versus Gaza, I think um, people have to maybe they tend to start the story halfway through. And I hear President Macron saying that there are too many people dying in Gaza. Well, it's not as if Israel decided one shiny morning to invade Gaza. There's something preceded that. And there are too many in relation to what? To the French war in sub-Saharan Africa, to the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there is no proportion here to the between the level of criticism and what's actually happening. And I think first, more proportion, I would say. Second, change the terminology. And three, really be, I always tell people in lectures that I give to combine conviction and ammunition. So they have to have the conviction. If they support Israel, of course, they already have the conviction, but they have to have the ammunition, the data, the information, the arguments to know to counter what people tell them. And often people I hear in campuses saying all sorts of crazy things. Israel occupied Palestine, that, there is a genocide in Gaza, there's no fuel, no electricity. Someone in a debate with me said that we're starving Palestinians as a war technique. And I said, well, in 1 month, Israel allowed 76,000 tons of humanitarian aid into Gaza. How is that starvation? So it's really about knowing how to counter these arguments, but also have very strong conviction in what we're
Yeah.
doing, which is
Plus the
following October 7, absolutely a war for Israel's eternity.
yeah, also the voices that talk about starvation also mention that Hamas is taking all the food that foreign nationalities are sending into Gaza as humanitarian aid. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the viewers. And if you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. 12 News Channel. Thank you very much.